we need to break away, I think, from the ideas that there is one right way to speak or write, and to be willing to have ourselves challenged as readers and listeners, especially when we encounter speakers or writers who speak or write with an accent, so to speak, or use language in different ways than what we expect.
Hi, I'm Nora Jones. Welcome to It's About Language. This podcast connects language and culture to life, learning, and hope. You'll experience insightful conversations with creative leaders in the fields of education, business, arts, and science. My guests shed light on the impact of language and culture on individuals and society as they share their stories and experiences. You'll be informed and inspired as we explore how language and culture make us human and bring hope in the midst of a challenging world. Well, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast today Adrienne Daly. Hi, Adrienne.
Hello.
And glad to have you with us today. And as folks are going to be able to tell from your bio, you have a really interesting background in which you have provided yourself with a pathway to a PhD in rhetoric and composition. And from what I can tell, a PhD in rhetoric and composition, Adrienne, means that you have majored in speaking and writing and
To
language.
to a certain extent, yes, definitely thinking about how we write, the ways that we might teach writing in particular, but also the ways that we use language in various contexts to persuade, to communicate, and that's where the rhetoric piece comes in. This idea of how do we communicate with others in these various contexts and persuade and move and get people make meaning with other people.
Make meaning with other people.
Mhm.
Now, that's an interesting concept because we're used to, especially in this series podcast, talking about making meaning for ourselves in language and then sharing it with others. Explain a little bit more about that concept.
Oh goodness. Well, so first of all, language is not something that we just use for ourselves, right? We use language to share our ideas with other people.
Hmm.
And so there has to be some common acceptance of the sounds or the marks that we're making, that we have to be able to commonly accept what they mean
Hmm.
in order to be able to share our ideas successfully, right?
Hmm.
So, um, so when we talk about making meaning, it's the idea that somehow we're able to communicate our ideas, our feelings, our thoughts in a way that's successful. But it's a two-way negotiation, so to speak, where um, often, it's the speaker and the listener, or the writer and the reader, is they have to both interact in some way, engage with each other, and be willing to be open and understand things in certain ways. And there has to be some common acceptance. So rhetoric has there's lots of different ways to understand rhetoric, but one of the ways I find really interesting that's been coming up and out a little bit is something called cultural rhetorics.
Hmm.
And it really looks at the ways that different cultural groups, and we can talk from everything what's called small cultures. So for instance, like knitting culture, people who knit,
Interesting.
okay,
Okay.
versus we think cultures like Chinese or American culture, but then of
Right.
course all the different subcultures in there. There's bigger cultures, but also the smaller cultures. So, for instance, I had a student when I was teaching a course on cultural rhetorics. Um, decide that for the text, so to speak, that he was going to create, so the writing that he was going to do, it was actually going to be a piece of electronic dance music.
Hmm.
And he talked about the culture and what goes into these things and why people do this. And he was able to talk about the different parts of the piece that he wrote and why he did it and what it means and what people in that community would expect to come at these certain points. There's this certain way of introducing the thing, and then there's a certain point where the music shifts and there's a lead up to it. It was really interesting how he broke down this song into the parts and the meaning. And I mean, you can just look around in our, you know, national media and stuff and understand the different ways that just one word, for instance, socialism, or for a less politicized one, let me see what I can think. You know, the idea of education or something. What does that mean to people? Or food.
Hmm.
The different ideas that we have around food and what it means to eat a meal together carry so much. So, for instance, if you're talking with somebody in potentially Iranian background or other cultures where the idea of sharing food together is so meaningful, and what you do when you invite somebody over for a meal. So when you say a meal in that context, it has a, quite a bit different than just talking about sharing a meal in
Hmm.
other contexts where it might not be as weighted with symbolism, or it might just mean, like popping something into the microwave and eating it then. So I think there's when you talk about making meaning, I feel like I'm getting off track a little bit. When you talk about making meaning, it's the idea that there's some shared understanding and ways of communicating those ideas, um, that can shift and change with whom you're talking to or working with. And that in order to do something, you might have to shift and change. For instance, if I was talking about rowing with one of my teammates from the rowing team, I'd be able to use a lot of different terminology. It's shorthand and you can talk about it. But then if I were explaining that to somebody else, it takes a lot more work to be able to explain the things of what they mean. And even then, some of the significance might be lost,
Hmm.
because they might not have personally had that experience. We can draw some parallels, but there's a layer of meaning that might not be there as there would be if I were talking to a teammate. So there's all these wonderful ideas of making meaning that come about, that depending on the relationships that people have and the communities that they're in and the differences that might be there, but also the commonalities that might be there.
Just fascinating because there were just so many ideas that you pulled out there.
There's a lot.
There was so much because it's such a rich experience, and obviously it is something that you've dedicated yourself to. I'd like to come to some of that again, if I might.
Hmm.
There has to be acceptance in order
Yes.
to be able to share. There needs to be a willingness and a curiosity, a common acceptance, and so forth. In your work with students or in your studies, both, how do you provide that approach to that understanding that it does take connection and cooperation, if you will?
That's a really great question. And certainly it is something that as a teacher, I'm still working with, because
Hmm.
it's a very profound aspect of communication. I've certain Most of the time I've worked with first year college students. When I teach writing, it's mostly with that group.
Okay.
So they're still moving from the idea of they're writing their ideas on paper just because that's what they're thinking, and moving from that idea to how do I get the other person to understand where I'm coming from.
Mm.
So the idea of an audience who isn't thinking quite the same way as you is a really difficult thing to wrap your mind around, certainly for all of us. And it takes a lot of work to get students to realize that, um, first, you have to talk about the idea of audience and the idea of going, someone else is going to read this. How are you going to make sure that your ideas come across the way you intend them to? How do you get your
Interesting.
reader or listener to arrive at the same point as you? What things will you need to do? And you have to really think about who will actually be reading this or listening to this, because there's no general audience.
Hmm.
There's no general audience. There's no way that you can have a broad general audience, because the person who's reading your piece in USA Today is not necessarily going to be the same person who might, if you write it for New York Times. There's going to be some different expectations. Even the publications themselves have different ways that they expect you to write that piece. So even if you were to take the exact same idea and more or less the same piece and try to move it between the two, you're still going to have to make changes to it. And you should make changes to it to be able to work with slightly different audiences. So people are coming, again, going back to even just the use of one particular word, people might have different experiences, different knowledges, different understandings of a particular word. And you have to keep that in mind as you're writing. If you really want to get across, you're just going, this word could mean different things. And how do I make sure that people understand what I mean when I say this word? Likewise, I might think it's a very obvious thing to say this, like everybody should learn languages, but that might not be an obvious, taken for granted conclusion by my reader.
Hmm.
They might need a little bit more persuasion to even accept this foundational fact that everybody should know more than one language, right?
Right. Hmm.
So working with students to help them understand, to think and analyze their potential audience is the really important, um, although rather difficult part. So that's an important part, just even talking about that idea and helping students to think about audiences and analyze for audiences. And then it's also the experience of having their work read by different people. So many college writing classes, and frankly, classes that use writing in general, whatever the discipline, um, it, students benefit from having other people read and give feedback on their writing, so
Hmm.
that they can understand that somebody reads it and might understand it differently or might not understand something because the student is writing in shorthand, so to speak.
Interesting.
So having that feedback, having people review your work and give you, be thoughtful, and you have to teach people how to do feedback, because most people can't get past the surface level of like, this
Mm.
sentence doesn't sound right, or you forgot your apostrophes or something like that. Having people to work with them on going, how do we give constructive feedback as readers, is another part that comes into play, certainly in the writing classroom, but in general as well, getting students to think beyond that, and it really allows them to start going, how do I how do I get the reader to be on the same page with me?
Feedback.
Hmm.
Let's go for that for just a moment, but take it back to the
Yeah,
cultural and linguistic
yeah.
background. What actions do you have in your courses or in the writing that you have done and the research that you have done about the nature of feedback that isn't just about, as you say, sentence structure or the use
Mhm.
of the semicolon here, but about the language and culture that they bring as readers or listeners to what's been shared?
So and what we're talking about is analysis on multiple levels,
Okay.
um, which this kind of analysis really has to come from encountering difference.
Hmm.
And a lot of freshman students and a lot of people in general haven't quite encountered enough difference to realize that they even have a culture. Um, so they have to be able to spend more time thinking about themselves as a person and who has distinct way of looking at the world. And I'm really serious that we do have students think about their own cultures. And I think that it is an important step to also have them think about how their culture and experiences might change how they are readers, and how that might change how they read something from their classmate. But even further back is being able to do their own analysis of themselves is is really important. And that's going to come by pointing out that they do have a culture, and doing, there are things that I've seen other teachers doing where they have students really reflect on who they are and what they think and stuff like that. I've done some of that in some other classes,
Mhm.
um, but and it really is the students were going, I don't have a culture, I don't think I have a culture. Like, yeah, yeah, you definitely do.
Mhm.
Um, but it can be really difficult at that for a lot of the younger students in particular, because they, like I said, they haven't encountered enough differences to see themselves clearly, if that makes sense. So it's creating those opportunities for them to do that, and also going, as this is something that we're going to plant. It's a seed that we're going to plant, and it's not necessarily going to flower anytime during the semester.
Right,
So,
exactly. Well, let me ask you a question because, here you are dealing with young people that are coming in that they say that I don't have a culture. Yes, you do. Mm. Can I say my presumption is that you don't happen to know that just because you are not an older teen or an early 20 person, but rather because of your own background linguistically and culturally? Do you think that that has made a difference?
for are you speaking for me myself?
Yes.
I think I was really lucky to have the opportunity to travel while quite young. And the experience of leaving the United States was pivotal in shifting my view of what life could be like.
Mm.
When you travel abroad in particular, but certainly if you travel to different locales that are different enough from your own, you realize that people do things differently. And you realize then what you do and your expectations, and even maybe how you talk, how you dress, how you eat. And it does allow you to get a better sense of yourself and your culture. And certainly if there's different languages involved, your own language and language practices. So I think I was really lucky in that regard to have that opportunity quite
Mm.
young,
Mhm.
and then to pursue further opportunities to really place myself in different places where I encountered stuff and was able to think about that.
Tell me about some of those that you might consider to be of high significance for your own personal development and what you apply to your work now.
Mm. Well, certainly one of the most um, notable, distinctive experiences was living in Japan for 2 years.
Ah.
So going over there for 2 years, and I didn't know Japanese going over there, so it was a new language for me entirely. And certainly there were people who spoke English around me, but there were few that were quite, and I'm always hesitant to use the word fluent. They weren't as fluent. They were able to use English and help me understand things, but it wasn't an easy communication, the same way that you would have with an English speaker. So it was, a really good experience of kind of using a lot of the context to make communication happen. Um, but it also, because Japan was so different from the Western cultures and places that I had been. The food is different. They drive on the different side of the road. The ways that they drive are different than what I experienced. The ways that they think about something. And I have a great story. One of my a funny story from that, which really emphasized for me a kind of a little theory that I had, is that when you travel and live overseas, you go over there and at first you're like, wow, things are so different. This is just different. You notice all those surface differences. And then when you're there for a while, it's kind of like, oh, well, you know what? Down at the bottom, like, everybody is really the same. You meet the same kinds of people. Some are really great, some are not so great. You've got people of all kinds, and all of us are just, working and living and eating and doing our things. And then you'll have an experience that really shows that even beyond that, there are some incredibly deep differences just in the very ways that we understand our world. And So I have two stories, and I'll try to tell them, and they're both actually the same woman in both of these stories.
Okay.
But the first story is the funny one, and I was sitting in the teacher room. So in Japan, this is a junior high school, so grades 6th through 8th, and in the junior high school, the students have their home rooms, but the teachers don't have a desk in the homeroom. The teachers all have their desks in one large teacher room. So there's an interesting difference for you. And so in the
Mhm.
mornings, all the teachers are gathered in that room and they have a meeting, and the teachers' desks are grouped together based on their grade. And so all of their things are in that one large teacher room.
Okay.
And then they go to the classrooms to do their teaching. So I was in the teacher room at my desk, and there was another woman working at a desk. And um, she looks over there and says, Jones's sensei, are you cold? And I said, no, 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 I'm okay. Really. I'm fine. So I went back to work. A minute later, she's like, Jones's sensei, are you cold? I said, "No, I'm not. Thank you." I'm just kind of a little confused why she keeps insisting on this. And she did it a third time. Are you cold? I'm like, no. And finally, I could see she was just so exasperated. And she kind of pulled on the back of her shirt. My shirt had ridden up and was exposing the skin along my back. And she was trying to draw my attention to it without embarrassing me. But of
Oh,
course, I didn't clue in at all, and the poor woman embarrassed her own self by trying to not embarrass me. And so that was a really interesting experience of going, I just missed the implied meaning under all that.
interesting.
But an even bigger example though was one day I was teaching in a classroom, and I was walking. There's the school had outside walkways between some of the wings, and I was walking. We found that a baby bird had fallen out of its nest, and I went, "Oh, baby bird!" And of course, the natural thing is to go, "Where's the nest? Oh goodness, I don't see a nest. I don't see any parents. We have to take care of this bird." So I pick it up, I find a little box and I put it in and I bring it into the teacher's room and see if I can figure out what to do for food and stuff like that. Food and water and taking care of this bird, because if we don't take care of this bird, it will die. It could potentially die. We don't want to just abandon it and leave it there to fend for itself because it will die. So we have a moral responsibility to see what we can do to save its life. So it's in the teacher's room and I'm trying to take care of it. And this lady comes over and she looks at me and it's almost anger. This anger. I was like, "What are you doing with this bird?" I'm like, trying to take care of it. And she got angry at me. She said, "You that if that bird dies, is basically as best as she could describe it." And I think we might have even had to have another one of the English teachers come in and translate or something. It's like, if that bird dies, its soul is now your responsibility. You are responsible for its death. You should have left it out
Mhm.
there
Mm.
because
Wow.
that was its fate. Now you have come in and tried to alter its fate. And so it was profoundly different understanding
Interesting.
of what I should have done in that circumstance. And I just remember just being floored by that idea. So that there's this incredible fundamental difference in understanding the world and understanding our role in it that completely changed the way we would have responded in that situation. So I just found that really fascinating.
And it's interesting because the words that you used, to go back to connect that with the I don't know, I have a culture, we all there's some differences and so forth. You mentioned there's a I had a natural reaction. I
Yeah,
had a moral
exactly.
responsibility, but in fact, both of those actions
Are not natural. A different kind of morality.
fascinating. Now, you've had a variety of experiences. So, part of what you have said to me that you are dedicated with is helping yourself, of course, but also others, bringing these kinds of histories into the
Yeah.
classroom to encourage students to embrace linguistic and cultural diversity. Eh, Connect that a little bit then more.
Sure. So having, I'm able to say the words natural reaction and moral responsibility because I was able to reflect on that experience,
Mm,
right?
okay.
So I was able to, like look back at it and go, this is what I understood as a natural reaction. This is what I understood as a moral responsibility. So being able to talk about that and being able to articulate that is really important, right? So you have to have the experience, but then you have to be able to reflect and then you have to be able to articulate it. But one of the things I think is important is that we have to bring those experiences with us into the classroom and highlight the idea of differences. I think stories like that can
Hmm.
help students to begin thinking about how they would have reacted in that situation, having them reflect how they might have acted, them reflect on what does that mean for them in terms of their own cultural understandings, and then of course taking the next step of being able to articulate. So you have to present opportunities to students to be able to think about these things, to be able to encounter things that could be potentially different
Mhm.
and use those um, thoughtfully to have students then be able to craft ideas about they themselves, but then start to understand that other people think and act and view the world differently. And then, only then, once we can start having that understanding, can you then think about, well, if that is the case, then how would I reach out to them? How would
Interesting.
I then communicate with them?
Mhm.
So, one semester in a college writing class is incredibly tight to try to fit in a lot of these
I
things,
would
and on top
imagine.
of with a lot of the other stuff that we want to be able to cover with students. So
Yes, I can
it's very, very
imagine.
difficult.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, you can only do so much with students, but being able to bring in your experiences and talk about them is an incredible part. And a lot of that also involves language. So, going in and exposing students to somebody who might not speak the same way as they do, or, the idea, another important idea that I bring in is the idea that we don't, people in the world don't just write in English.
Interesting. Okay, certainly.
So getting students to realize that, we don't write in English all the time, all around the world. Students are coming into the classroom with this idea of English only. When we write, it's in English. And so I think there's more that can be done, certainly at the K through 12 level, but also at the college level to encourage students to think about writing as more than just English. And for one example of one thing that I did was I taught a community-based writing course where the students over the course of the semester had to really go out and they had to create sort of volunteer projects with organizations. And I had what part of the beginning of the semester was me saying to them, "What languages do you know other than English?"
Hmm.
Those are resources. Okay. So keep
Okay.
those in mind. You can use those languages. You can use them for speaking to people. You can use them for writing. You can also use them for research. Okay. We can research in languages other than English. And I don't think students really fully grasped that. And that is something that I try to bring out in all my classes. But for the case of this particular course, encouraging students to think about their languages as an asset that can be used in these community projects, and the knowledges that they have, the intuition that they have, that you write and speak in different ways, in different contexts, and to different people. So it's just building on that and bringing that to their attention.
That's beautifully said. And so take a moment now. Imagine our listening audience. You turn
Yes.
to that audience and you
Mhm.
say, as for you, I would like to advise you this, invite you
Mhm.
this, warn. What is it that you would like to do as you turn to the audience today?
I would like to invite people to do, I think, two things. First is to really think about their own language histories. Then, and by language history, I mean both the languages and language practices that they already have and use, but also the experiences around language that they have. So to really consider their own language histories and to ask themselves how they bring that into the classroom or how they bring that into their work, whatever they're doing. And can they do more to bring that in and be more visible or audible and more open in that to encourage diversity by bringing in their own diversity. So that I think that's my first invitation. The second
Okay.
invitation is to encourage people to be more flexible in responding and listening and reading other people's language practices, to not always expect or insist on exactly the same language practices, that when they encounter things that they might see as wrong or different, to sit with them and to ask, does this really impede communication or do I really understand it just fine? It just sounds different. To be more to and to encourage others to do that as well. Um, I just we need to break away, I think, from the ideas that there is one right way to speak or write, and to be willing to have ourselves challenged as readers and listeners, um, especially when we encounter speakers or writers who speak or write with an accent, so to speak,
Hmm.
or use language in different ways than what we expect. To really just kind of go, this is cool. This is amazing. And I think for those of us in particular who, whether we're teachers or editors or whatever, to not be so quick to change or to mark down things that in the past might be seen as wrong,
Okay.
to allow more difference in there and to be able to navigate and negotiate that a little bit more.
You know, you've been talking about encountering differences, and here you just made a very poignant invitation to everyone. And I thank you for it because to be able to accept, to be able to diversify, to be able to negotiate, engage, and be around. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Adrienne,
Welcome.
for providing such insights in so many directions today. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
It's been an interesting one for me to voice these thoughts. So thank you.
Mm. Well, and I know that you're making such a difference in those students with whom you work in your university settings and those whose work you edit. So thank you for what you're doing to bring a greater sense of acceptance and diversity into their lives. And who knows where all those seeds will flourish into beautiful plants. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And do take care.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Let's continue the conversation. Be sure to check out my website, fluencyonline.com, to learn more about our guests and to check out the resources and information they've shared with us there. I have other ideas, resources, and opportunities there for you too. Again, thanks so much for listening, and until next time,